The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Thank you. Good morning, and it's a great pleasure indeed and privilege to be here. And when I told my partner that back home that I was coming to Holyoke, he thought it was spelt Holy O-A-K, and when I was coming to a kind of sacred grove, so, which I suppose I am. Anyway, it's delightful to be here. And let me get the commercials over with straight away. I'd just like to let you know about my book on Russia, which you have a flyer in your pack, I think. I'm delighted that Quest are going to publish this. The UK edition is already out, and Quest will be publishing it next year, as you can see, under a slightly different title. So I hope you'll have a chance to read it one way or another. And the theme I'm going to take this morning is that of folk religion, or the cultural dimension of religion, which has always intrigued me. And it's no surprise that I'll take Russia as my main country of reference, but I will be referring to one or two other countries as well. And one way of looking at Christianity, and probably any religion, is to say that there are three strands to it. There is the orthodox, conventional strand, what's taught and practiced in the churches. There is the personal strand, which is your own beliefs and practices and experiences. And then there's this third strand, which is often ignored or overlooked, which is the folk dimension of religion. And yet I think it's a very important, a very creative dimension, and one which can give us a great deal in our own spirituality. The scholar Marion Bowman, she's a Scottish lady, but she did her MA in comparative religion in Newfoundland, and she took as her thesis the Saint Gerard, if I'm pronouncing it right, of Newfoundland, and the attention that local women give to him. And this is again a part of the cultural dimension, because although St. Gerard isn't a very prominent saint, and apparently he was rather a sort of sickly, celibate young man who died young, nevertheless they've elevated him to be their patron saint of pregnancy and childbirth. And apparently most women in Newfoundland still revere him as that, and wear medals and so on, and attribute many miracles and savings of babies and of mothers to this saint. And so Bowman's take on religion is that it isn't always what you're meant to believe according to the orthodox tenets. It's actually what goes on and what people do practice and believe, and where that has a collective dimension to it. She calls that folk religion. And the quote that stands out for me in her work is, she says, "I would like to suggest that accounts of religion which do not take into account folk religion risk telling less than the whole story." And so by looking at the folk religion, we're maybe beginning to fill out that whole story. And by having three strands that I've mentioned, the orthodox, the personal, the folk, well, with three strands you can braid, I think you say here, we say plait, you can create a nicely woven strand. If you only have two, they're always kind of battling against each other. So the threefoldness, I think, is also a very useful thing to bear in mind. The first element of this that I want to touch on is the relationship of Christianity to the land, to the country where it's practiced. and thereby to the culture of the people there. And this is quite an interesting phenomenon, a sense that your own land is in some way, has a sacred quality which is directly connected to Christianity. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples which are not Russia to start with. And by the way, all the pictures you're going to see today have been taken on my travels or from my own collection, so they represent an element of personal experience for me. And I want to mention first Ethiopia, a country I visited some time ago. The Ethiopians have a very strong sense of their land as sacred to Christianity. They claim to be the first Christianized country. I think they claim it to have been Christian since about 200 AD, something like that. The country, they say, of Sheba. There's a wonderful story about Sheba and Solomon, which I hope I have time to tell you towards the end. And they believe that they have the Ark of the Covenant. And this isn't just a kind of a Dan Brown kind of take on it. They really do claim to have the Ark of the Covenant. And every church in their country has its own replica of the Ark of the Covenant. So the whole land is sacred in that respect. But there's one place I visited which fascinated me called Lalibela. And Lalibela is actually said to be a model of the Holy Land itself. It's famous for these extraordinary rock-cut churches. The sort of the top of the ground that you walk on is kind of up here somewhere, and then you look down onto these amazing churches. There's 12 or 13 of them. They're all carved in different geometrical and symbolic shapes. They're all dedicated to different saints and so on. So they have a whole kind of culture attached to them. There you are. You can see the ground there, and if you look over the abyss, you'll look down onto one of these churches. But also the land around the churches and in the village is, there's the Mount of Olives, there's the Garden of Gethsemane. So you're kind of walking over the holy places. It's like a kind of microcosm of the Holy Land. And I don't think you can get much closer towards, demonstrating the point of a sacred connection with Christianity, with the land there. There's one of the priests. And, they're very, very colourful people indeed. I'll have a couple more slides towards the end. Another church in a different style. But now let me move you from Africa to England. And I expect some of you know what we're looking at there, which is Glastonbury. In fact, I think some of you have been there from conversations I've had. And Glastonbury Tor. And this is the English version. This is the Jerusalem of England, as it's been called. And in England, we're very fond of the hymn Jerusalem. I don't know if you sing that over here, basically about Christ coming to this green and pleasant land. That's a great favourite. But Glastonbury, according to some legends, is where Christ came to in England. And more specifically, actually, and probably more likely in historical terms, it's said to be where Joseph of Arimathea came, the disciple of Christ. This is the ruins of the wonderful Glastonbury Abbey, which was wrecked by Henry VIII, and the whole place was a great centre of pilgrimage, still is, actually, and said to have various holy relics and so on. It has also mixed in with the whole culture there. You have the holy wells. This is Chalice Well, decorated for solstice celebration. The Red Well. I could go on about these, but I won't, because I'll get too distracted. So there's a whole plethora of holy places and holy things at Glastonbury. It's a kind of curious place in some ways, a great mixing of the energies, but it retains its position as a sacred place with a very specific connection to Christianity in the English landscape. And there we're looking somewhat dramatic shot of Weary Hill. This is said to be the actual place where St. Joseph of Arimathea arrived in England and where he planted his staff, and his staff grew into a hawthorn tree. The tree is still there. Well, actually, it's a descendant of the tree because Oliver Cromwell's men cut it down because they thought it was idolatry. But slips of that tree had been planted around the area, and the original tree had some children, as it were, so they took a slip and planted it back on Weary Hill, where it still stands to this day. So that's a sense that England also has its sacred places, and there are many other countries which will have those kinds of associations. So this gives people of the country something very kind of palpable to latch on to in terms of feeling that their land has a connection with Christianity. And I think it's important, even if we take it for granted, because I think religion needs this third dimension, otherwise it can become very kind of fundamentalist and a bit flat, or maybe not relevant to where you live. So having the sense of the land as sacred is an important dimension. And also moving from land to nature in terms of folk religion, it can help to give a sense that nature and God are connected and not divided as they are in some religious views. I think it's something we probably all feel as children, this kind of palpable sense of the mysteries of nature, of nature as a kind of mysticism in itself, really. And it's helpful to be able to relate that to Christianity or to a religion, rather than see it as something totally divided that shall never meet. This is the thorn in Glastonbury again, and this is the one that's planted in the Abbey churchyard. And the great thing about this thorn is that it's said to bloom on Christmas Day. It's a hawthorn. Do you have hawthorn here? Yes. And it doesn't normally bloom on Christmas Day, does it? No, nor does ours. It's the Mayflower. But this one actually does. I took this photograph at the winter solstice. There it is in bloom. And they send a sprig each year to the Queen to have on her breakfast table on Christmas Day. For the botanically minded among you, I believe it's meant to be a different species of, a Mediterranean species of hawthorn. So, but that's kind of okay, because Joseph of Arimathea would have brought a different type of hawthorn anyway. So there's usually different dimensions to this, but it is a kind of almost like a nature miracle that you can go to Glastonbury and find this flower blooming at the middle of winter. So, moving on into the churches themselves, and we'll soon be at Russia, but let me show you a few elements from churches in, I think these are all taken from British churches, where for those of you who have been and looked at the old churches there, you'll see that there's lots of weird and amazing symbols there, which on the face of it have nothing to do with Christianity. Here we can see have a mermaid. Can you see with her? She's got her mirror there. There's quite a few mermaids. And the usual explanation for this is that, well, the incoming religion overlaid the older pagan religion, so-called, but elements of it still remain. And I had always found this a very unsatisfactory explanation, really. Okay, historically it may be correct. And it wasn't until I was reading Lindsay Clark's well-known novel, The Chemical Wedding, about it's an alchemical theme, when the kind of the light dawned, because he makes a thing about these symbols. They are in juxtaposition to one another. The symbols of the older religions, I'd rather call them that than pagan, and Christianity. They form this kind of dynamic polarity, which again present challenges, but kind of can enrich the sense of the religion that you practice. And I think that's a more kind of productive take on them. This is the Green Man. I'm sure you've all heard of the Green Man. And again, you can go into, well, I don't know how many, but maybe 1 in every 4 or 5 old churches in England will have a Green Man somewhere or other, the nature spirit. And there he is again. And then I'm going to show you something not entirely suitable for Sunday morning. So avert your eyes now if you don't want to see. This is known as a Sheila na gig, and I'll leave you for yourselves to work out what it is. So this is the woman exposing her vulva, and the sense of the primitive feminine, if you like, or the mother, however you want to see it. But the churches aren't without their kind of powerful feminine element. And so these do relate in one sense to older religions, but they are there in the church at the same time as the Christian symbols, and together they make the whole place more powerful. So, I think we're going to go into Russia now. And you've heard that the reason why I've chosen Russia, well, one of the reasons I've chosen Russia is because I've been there so much and I've done a great deal of research into the folk traditions and so on. And the way of life, although it's changed and is changing, many of these elements still remain. And it's a country which has an incredible integration of the folk tradition with everyday life and with modern day life. It hasn't been rejected and cast aside. So it's a very good place to take as an example. Country life is still lived much as it was centuries ago, and is all the better for that, I think. And the religion in Russia, Orthodox Christianity came to Russia in, I think it was 988, but it didn't entirely obliterate what was there before, the earlier gods, the earlier religion. And it became known as the country of two faiths, Dvayoverie, that the old religion, which you might like to call nature religion, though again it's a bit of a bland term, and Christianity sat happily side by side and do really until this present day. So again, going back to the idea of the green man in the churches, you've got the idea of this kind of dynamic at work, rather than a kind of either-or situation. I take lots of pretty pictures of landscapes in Russia, just to give you some idea that the whole landscape has an enchanted quality to it, which is one of the themes I've gone into in my book. And it's a country where nature spirits are recognised. This is actually a fairy tale spirit called Snow Maiden, but she is the spirit of the delicacy and beauty of winter that melts away each spring. And sometimes her companion, Father Frost, there. I'd love to talk to you about Russian nature spirits, but that's another lecture. So draw myself back to my theme, but it's good to have some sort of sense of the background. And as for Russia itself, well, what I mentioned earlier, the sense of a country having a connection with the sacred Christianity, Russia does consider itself to be a new Holy Roman Empire and has done since Christianity came. So they have a sense that their whole country is sacred in the Christian sense as well. And during the time of communism, as you will know, religion wasn't totally suppressed, but it was certainly oppressed. And some of the people I talked to, they were baptized in secret, for instance, by their grandmothers. And they would never proclaim their faith openly, because to do so would mean that they could lose their job, they would never be given permission to travel, and they could be given a very hard time indeed. So it went underground to a degree. But now it's having a huge revival again, as you probably know. People are flocking back to the churches. If you want to be anyone, you've got to be baptized. But there's still a lovely kind of innocence and freshness about it, I found. For example, some of the people I met, they'd only just got hold of a Bible for the first time. And they were reading it like they'd never read it before. And they would say, and Moses went up the mountain, and do you know what happened next? And I'd say, yes, actually I do. But it was kind of a wonderful adventure story to them, a wonderful story. And I don't mean to sort of downgrade it, but, you know, and I thought, in a way, I kind of envied them coming to it all for the first time. So there's a great hunger and a great eagerness to re-embrace Christianity again and keeping the old traditions. And in the churches, this is a little bit of a dark picture. This was taken up in Murmansk, which is in the very north of Russia, where I was lucky enough to go one point, and they've built a new church there. That's the iconostasis. I'll be talking a little bit about icons later. But can you see here there's a tree? It's actually a birch tree. And I thought I'd show this as, again, a symbol of how things unite there in the church. Because the birch is the old sacred tree of Russia, well, one of the sacred trees, but the most prominent one. It's considered to be very feminine, and it's particularly associated with the spring festival, which has become merged with what they call the Trinity or Troitsa festival in the Russian Orthodox Church, or what we would call Whitsun. And so it's customary now to bring the birch tree Spring Festival symbol into the church at that time, and I was there just after they'd had the Troitsa Sunday. And by the way, I know that Russia is not unique in this respect in combining symbols, but it does provide really good examples of how it happens. And none better really than the Russian house, the traditional Russian wooden house known as an izba. This has a wonderful integration. It's a kind of cosmological structure in its own right, as scholars agree. And traditionally it's built, well, I think it's built on 3 levels. It has 3 levels to it, but most of the living is done on the ground floor in the big living quarters. This is actually the house I bought in the village of Holovy in Russia. And upstairs, very often there is a small unheated attic. Of course, something being unheated, well, in New England, you know, winters count for something, so an unheated room is something you don't use all the time. And below, through a trap door very often, somewhere in the ground, there would be a kind of a cellar. Practical terms used for storage, but all these levels, these 3 levels, have their own symbolism. The ground floor, as you would expect, is the human world. It's where you live and you eat and you sleep. And the downstairs, the cellar, is where the ancestors live, or the domovoi, the spirit of the house, who you must take care not to offend. And if you move house, you should tie him up in a sack and take him with you and offer him a bowl of porridge when you get there, because although he's a bit of a trickster, your family fortunes depend on him, so you need to be nice to your house spirit. So that's the association with the cellar. Upstairs in the unheated room is where very often people would go for magical practices, divination. Very often the young girls, and to this day, young girls in Russia do a lot of fortune-telling games. And that was the place where the sky spirits reside. So I'll just go to the next. These are some, I'm not digressing, these are some carvings taken off a roof gable. And if you are in Russia and you start to look at the different carvings, you'll see that very often the ones on the highest level are things like these peacocks and grapes which symbol paradise, or they may be a horse which symbols something that leaps up to the sky, or they may be a sun, a solar symbol. All this has kind of been documented and recorded. It's not some sort of fancy of my own. You could see from the previous one that the houses do have these sort of lovely carvings, and they are in most cases symbolic. So anyway, up the top of the house was where you'd do your magical practice with the help of the sky spirits, who are perhaps a little bit more benevolent than the ancestors and the domovoi down below. And we can see here a girl practicing the gazing in the mirror divination, where you would, in a sort of semi-darkness, you would look and see if you could see the form of your future husband coming into the mirror and gazing at you. Apparently quite a scary thing to do. Oh, I didn't mean the husband would be scary, but scary to see a face in the mirror. Well, it might be scary. And here is another girl also doing a kind of mirror-gazing divination. There were various things you could do. You could float candles in bowls of water, different ways that you could predict the future. And, of course, girls are always interested in love. So I suppose they're the ones who've kept the fortune-telling traditions going the strongest. Another thing they do and did, which is interesting in terms of the loose hair that was talked about yesterday, I think in connection with Sophia, was that in Russian society, the braiding of the hair is considered to be a sign of being in civilized society. Likewise, the wearing of a braided belt. If you unbraid your hair, you're inviting the magical forces in. You're inviting the forces beyond the safe world of society to enter in. So, you know, the girls going up to the top floor, unbraiding their hair, gazing in mirrors and so on. It was a bit of fun, but it's also, you know, quite a serious and a little bit of a scary business. The fretwork around the windows Well, there are two theories about why practically every Russian country house has fretwork in different styles and patterns. One is that it's to keep the evil spirits out of the house and protect it. The other is that if you have a daughter of marriageable age and you sit her in the window spinning, she will look very attractive to young men passing by. So you can take your pick, or maybe both are true, because I think very often things have different levels. So now you're probably wondering where Christianity comes into all this. So that's the kind of cosmology of the Russian home. If we, as it were, go into the ground floor level, the living quarters, what we will find there is what's called the red corner, which is the subject of my talk. And this is the holy Christian corner of the home. And many Russian homes still have this, many urban homes still have this. This is where you keep your family icon. It should be high up, and traditionally the entrance would be opposite, and the entrance would be quite low, so that anybody coming in would have to stoop and, as it were, bow to the holy icon as they came in. And this icon is usually displayed with one of these towels, so-called, around it, linen towels, long. You don't use them for, drying yourself. They're kind of ceremonial towels. And they are nearly always embroidered in red. Now, the important thing about red in Russian is that it means beauty. I bet you never knew that about the Red Army. But the word krasny, red, comes from the same root as krasivy, which means beautiful. And red has the symbolism of beauty, of life, of energy and divine fire. So this is actually, this is a folk tradition. It is not a specifically Christian tradition. So there you see the merging of this ancient tradition. Some of the symbols embroidered just on these towels are very, very ancient indeed. This is one I have in my possession. And after some research, I discovered that this is actually the Great Mother here. She's often portrayed in this triangular form with her arms uplifted. And actually, in that kind of primordial form, she's found across Asia and parts of Central Asia. And in this Russian tradition here, she's shown on the back of a horse, which is a sky creature. So Mother Earth, the Great Mother, Mother Earth, is uniting with the sky symbol there. And that is the kind of towel that you would find draped around a Christian icon. I'll just go back for you to get a look at it. Again, you'll see the birch trees there brought in. This is actually a kind of more like a display red corner, because I just happened to be able to take a picture of it, but it's typical of what you'd find in a Russian home. The birch decorated with ribbons, as is the tradition, each ribbon a wish or a prayer for Trinity Sunday, Whitsun, and the family icon there. And the family icon is a very personal thing. For example, nowadays, if a young couple are going to get married, it's quite common for the father to take down the icon from the house and to take it with the couple to the church, so that the blessing of the young couple in the Orthodox service will be accompanied by the family icon. And it's also said to represent the family fortunes. And I noticed at the time of the sinking of the Kursk submarine, do you remember that, a few years ago, that terrible loss of life when the submarine went down? They interviewed an old grandmother from northern Russia, and she was weeping and sobbing, and she's saying, "My grandson's on there," she said, "and last night the family icon fell down, so I know the news is bad." So, kind of your heart went out to her. And an icon, as you're probably aware, is not just a religious painting. It's meant to be an actual connection to the divine, something you can gaze at and through which you might gain some understanding of the divine. I'll come back to that point in a moment, but I just got another nice picture to show you the ceremonial towel in terms of hospitality. So this is another use for it, as well as adorning an icon. This is the traditional bread and salt hospitality ritual, which is still used more for kind of grand occasions, like when a new bride comes to visit her mother-in-law for the first time. The mother-in-law may offer her bread and salt, the ultimate symbol of hospitality, on the beautiful embroidered towel. And here it was being offered to us visitors. We were going down the river in Russia. But it's a lovely custom. I mentioned that it's in the living quarters and it's traditionally opposite the entrance. But there's another polarity. There are lots of these polarities tied in, and that is the stove. Does everyone know what a Russian stove looks like? Maybe, maybe not. Oh, it's a great big brick-built thing, usually, plastered over, and it acts like a kind of giant storage heater with a small firebox. And traditionally there's a kind of shelf on the top where you could actually sleep, and people did sleep to keep warm, be a bit below the ceiling. I mean, I've met people who, you know, were put to sleep on stoves when they were kind of in lodgings, as it were. And so you have the icon representative of Christianity and Christian tradition, and nearby you have this symbol of Mother Stove, Piechka, she's called, who represents the heart and the warmth of the home. And again, this is a very strong tradition. So the ground floor kind of acknowledges both these aspects of life. And then another polarity is that of the bathhouse. Most Russian country houses don't have running water, even to this day. And so the method of getting clean is to have a steam bath once a week, either in your bathhouse or your friends or your relatives. And this is a separate little wooden hut out in the garden. Too dangerous to have it in the house because of the risk of fire and so on, heating up the stones to make the water hot and so on. And this is also a place to do with ancient rituals and magic, again in a kind of polarity with the red corner. It's where girls went on the night before they were married with their girlfriends and performed all sorts of magical rituals and washing rituals, and sometimes the local wizard would come and help out. And the spirit of the bathhouse is known as the bannock. This is one representation of him. And like most of these creatures, he's very tricksy. You have to keep on the right side of him. When I was up on the island of Kizhi in northern Russia, they have some young people there who kind of guide visitors around in the summer. And one of them told me that most of the guides, the young guides, they always respect the bannock. They leave him a little offering of soap and a fir twig, which is what you're meant to do. But there was one young man who said he didn't believe in such superstitious rubbish. And when he went to go in the door, he hit his head really hard on the lintel. His glasses fell off, he trod on them and broke them. And since then, he's always left an offering for the bannock. So, as I say, Russians are perfectly capable of holding all these beliefs in their minds at once. And that's the domovoi, by the way, who I mentioned earlier. These are just representations. These are shape-shifting creatures. They can take different forms. And that's actually one of the lacquer miniatures that I had in the collection, showing a scene of a wedding at home. And again, you can see the icons up there, prominent above the new bride and groom. So that gives you some idea of how the Russian house can really incorporate both Christianity in a very personal, meaningful sense, and also elements of the older traditions and religions. And the homes are still places where fairy tales are told and where people really appreciate that strand of their culture. I want to say a little bit about icons now, although they're not, you know, kind of folk in the same way. They are a very deep subject and sometimes a tricky one to unravel, and people have very strong views about icons and what they mean and who should paint them and who should have them and so on. So I don't go too far into that territory. But as I mentioned, they are seen as having a personal connection with the person who gazes at them. And I find that sometimes icons really seem to, as it were, speak to me or have meaning for me. Other times it's almost like a blank wall that I can't penetrate. And I think everybody has a different response to them. Once I did have quite a profound experience looking at an icon. I was actually in the little village of Holloway where my house is, and they've got a museum of all these lacquer miniatures that are painted there, and they have icons there as well, painted by people in the village in times gone by. And I was looking at one of John the Baptist, and one of the common representations of John the Baptist is that he is holding an enormous basin or cup or chalice, and there is a tiny homunculus in there, which is the Christ figure. Which reminds me, I dreamt about a tiny homunculus last night, so that's interesting. It's quite a powerful image. I wish I had one to show you, but I don't. But I think you can imagine it. And I was gazing at this icon, and I was thinking, how is it that religions can have such a different view on what happens after you die? In Christianity, you go to heaven. In Buddhism, you're reborn. And I was just looking at this icon, and as I looked at it, suddenly I knew something about that. I could understand at some level how there was a commonality of truth there. There was truth behind both those things. Now, I couldn't put it into words. I couldn't say to you, oh, it's because of this and this and this. But there was a knowing in that moment of gazing. And so I think that's possibly one of the keys to the icons, is the idea of the gazing at them. And it almost becomes like a dialogue. Or if you have a question, just pose it, and maybe you'll receive something in return. We talked, well, I think it was talked yesterday about the ability to receive as well as to project, and I think that's very important where icons are concerned. This is an icon of the Mother of God. She's usually called in Russian icons Mary, and icons are also considered to be wonder-working. I think I've got the right one here. I think this is the icon of Vladimir, which is said to have saved Moscow from invaders. And in terms of local traditions, which again, I think folk religion can be about local traditions, even if they are more kind of orthodox. It was interesting that during the communist times, this icon was put in the Tretyakov Museum in Moscow as an exhibit, not as a holy thing, and yet it's one of the most sacred icons in the whole of Russian history. But people wouldn't be deterred. They kept coming and leaving bunches of flowers by it. And now, in this more liberal age, they've actually built a new... They've come to a compromise because the church wanted it, the museum wanted it. They've built a new chapel within the Tretyakov Museum, housing the Virgin of Vladimir. So everyone is just about happy, I think. So icons, interesting, deep, and sometimes tricky subject. I'm going to move on to, well, we'll see a couple more icons, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the element of creativity in the Russian folk tradition in terms of saints and prophets. And the Russians have had a very kind of, almost like a playful way of combining saints with their old gods. And one of the most prominent examples is that they have combined the old thunder god, Perun, with the prophet, or saint they might call him, Elijah. And they have become kind of almost like one thing in Russian religion and belief. I kind of wondered, why are they showing Elijah in such a fearful way? You know, Elijah was swept up to heaven on a fiery chariot, and as far as I'm concerned, he's quite a mystical figure. But no, in Russia, they seem to always depict him as being a kind of a wrathful prophet. And then I learned it's because he's associated with the thunder god. He went up to heaven in a fiery chariot, and, you know, from there he cast down thunderbolts on wrongdoers. So that's that was the face of Elijah you saw, and there you can see his fiery chariot. And there are a lot of things you have to do to kind of please Elijah and not get on the wrong side of him. Like, you must not till your fields or harvest your crops on his feast day, which I think is in August. Yes, I think it is. However, although you wouldn't want to be struck by his lightning, there is also a tradition in Russia that if you're struck by lightning, you go directly to heaven. So there is some consolation. It's a kind of double-edged thing, as many of these traditions are. And people also say that they can find Elijah's thunder arrowheads, and these are actually an old kind of fossil which get turned up out of the earth every now and then. I haven't got the technical name here. I think it's belemnites, but I'm not sure. And they were considered to be powerful magical talismans. In other words, they were considered to be the kind of the residue of thunderbolts which Elijah had chucked down. And if you could get hold of one of those, it was kind of a magical tool that you could use. But although Elijah was scary, he also would send the rain that you need. And so here's a quote from one author which says, "Peasants imagined that he carried water on his chariot to all the saints in heaven, and when he spilled a little, life-giving moisture fell to earth. It was therefore to Elijah that they prayed for rain." So he was a rainmaker too. So all these are quite clearly elements that go with a kind of nature religion or earlier religion as well. I'll come back to a little story about Elijah later. Now, here's a beautiful and well-known icon, Andrei Rublev's Trinity. And it gives me leave to talk a little bit about the Russian tradition to do with angels and with this particular subject. These are the guests who came to Abraham and Sarah's table. And if you recall from the Bible, well, certainly the versions of the Bible I've got just say that, I think, is it 3 men appeared in the heat of the day to Abraham and Sarah. And Abraham showed them great respect, and he recognized that they'd come from the Lord, and he offered them hospitality, again, picking up on a theme from yesterday. And they told him as they left that Sarah would bear a child, which she didn't expect because she was past childbearing age, and as we heard yesterday, she laughed, but it came to pass. Well, that story is certainly pretty well known from in England, where I come from, and I'm sure it's a well-known part of the Bible over here. But what we don't have is the tradition in Russian Orthodoxy that these guests are considered to be angels, and they are also considered to represent the Trinity. And what I was finding was I took some tour groups to Russia, and we would go and stand in front of this icon in the Tretyakov Gallery. And the sort of local guide would start off talking about angels and Abraham and Sarah and Trinity, and people would be going, "Hey, what?" And I'd say, "Look, excuse me, just a moment. We have to explain this is not in our culture. Our people don't realise that the guests are seen as angels in the Trinity," which caused her some astonishment because she didn't realise that not everyone thought that way. So you have these beautiful local traditions in Christianity. And Rublev was one of the most well-known and respected icon painters. And although he didn't actually have a complete monopoly of that image, because you can see it became, I don't know whether he originated it, because there's a lot of common imagery that goes through icons. You can see another version of it there. But I thought, if I've got time, you might like to just hear a little bit of how that can be interpreted. I think if I've got my notes here. Because these icons, particularly Rublev's, can be full of symbolism and geometric forms and so on. So I looked at 2 or 3 different interpretations of this, and I think I'll only give you one. And the one I liked best was not the one from the scholars that I found, but when I eavesdropped on a Russian guide talking in French to her French tour group, and I made notes, and I thought it was a beautiful interpretation. So what she says is there are 3 chalices in this picture, one on the table, one is the table itself, and one is the form created by the 3 angels. So there's a trinity of chalices. There is no joy without sacrifice. The chalice is the symbol of the sacrifice. The colours, she said, the blue of the sky, which I'm afraid you can't see very well here, and some of the paint's deteriorated anyway. I think they've restored it since. The green of nature, the rich brown red of the earth, again, that shows up if you see it for real, are to be worked on. They are nature. They are the background of nature, which this happens. The golden light behind is the sun itself, and the whole icon represents the sun and the light of the spirit. The 3 angels are like 3 tones of a musical melody, 3 notes bound in one circle. Each is different, but all are connected. And in the background is the Tower of Wisdom. the wisdom of God, or Sophia, we might say. And my looking at it seemed to suggest a definite difference between these three angels. The right, I'll make sure it's the right way around, the right-hand angel to me seemed to absorb and darken the energy slightly, throwing it downwards. The left angel seems to project and concentrate it. And the central angel looks outwards in love, like a manifestation of the creative spirit within the world. So there's some thoughts for you on that particular icon. This is when I start to lose all my paperwork. And again, local traditions that can happen. And another thing that happens with saints in Russian tradition is that they tend to merge with some of the older nature spirits or goddesses or whatever, and form a kind of wonderful hybrid. So that, for example, we have Saint Eudocia, I think I'm pronouncing that right, sounds like an old Greek name to me, but she's known as Yevdokia the Raspberry Giver, and her feast day is August the 17th. So the saint of raspberries, the goddess of raspberries, a Christian saint and a goddess. And I have this wonderful book called A Russian Folk Calendar, and it's got something like this for practically every day. So on the 17th of August, the feast day of St. Eudocia, popularly dubbed Yevdokia the Raspberry Giver, by this day raspberries would be ripe and the picking of them began. It was a time for making raspberry jam, drying the raspberries and baking sweet and fragrant raspberry pies, whose aroma would bring to mind the passing summer with its blossoming meadows and the lapping of the water in the river. It gets very poetic, this book. It was known from days of old that an abundant crop of raspberries was a sign of a good harvest of grain. So this whole thing of the saints' days, the days of the old gods and goddesses and nature, was also connected very often with prophecy and divination, particularly to do with agriculture and weather divination. And it concludes, on August the 17th, people kept an eye on the weather. Good weather on this day was a sign of a fair November. So that was August the 17th, and if that was nice, you'd have a good November. So there are all these sort of traditions beautifully interwoven, and many of them still carried on today. I remember Apple Sunday in August, the day when you were meant to go to church and then you could start eating apples. The caretaker of the house I had came a little bit merry, let's say, and he said, well, he'd already started eating apples. He couldn't wait for the church to bless them, but he thought he'd have a little tot of vodka instead to celebrate the day. So they're great party folk, Russians. And there is also a celebration on November the 4th, which is called Kazan Merrymaking. And that's actually a kind of feast and a day of games and fun to celebrate an actual icon from Kazan, another famous icon. So there are also stories associated with the saints, and I won't have time to talk much about these, but it's very creative, as though the Russians are not afraid to play a little bit with what they have inherited of the Christian tradition, what they have at their disposal. And there's a wonderful story about St. Nicholas, Elijah, and a peasant. Now, St. Nicholas is the kind of the good guy in the Russian peasant tales. He's on the side of the humble folk. St. George is very grand and goes around killing dragons and that, but it's St. Nicholas that you want to kind of help you out. He's still a very, very popular saint. If you go to that place in southern Turkey where St. Nicholas is meant to have come from, is it Smyrna or Myra, I think it's called now? And there are lots of Russian visitors there, and they're even selling bits of the earth from the church now because they know when they're on to a good thing. Anyway, I mustn't get too sidetracked. So this is a story about a peasant who ignored the prohibition on working his fields on St. Elijah's feast day in August, and his corn was doing really well. But St. Nicholas and Elijah were out for a walk one day around these fields. And Elijah saw these fields and he said, that man disobeyed me, so I'm going to send a thunderstorm and a hailstorm to destroy his crops. So St. Nicholas didn't say anything, but he went to find the peasant and he said, look, Elijah's got it in for you. And what I suggest you do is go to the priest and offer to sell him the rights to harvest your corn. This is a terrible tale of trading on commodity futures, this story, because the corn's looking good. So the peasant goes to the priest, and the priest agrees to buy it. Elijah sends his thunderstorm, flattens the fields. But, you know, this is all part of St. Nicholas's plan. And St. Nicholas then goes to Elijah and he said, how could you do that? That field belonged to the priest and now you've destroyed it. So Elijah says, oh, whoops, sorry, I'll put it back the way it was. So he restores the corn. St. Nicholas goes back to the peasant and says, look, what I think you should do now is go to the priest, offer to buy back his rights in the corn and keep it. He won't want any more to do with it now. It's been flattened once. So the peasant goes back, buys back the rights in the corn, makes a real profit from it. And St. Nicholas says, oh, you know, by the way, Elijah is still not too happy about this, but I think if you buy the biggest candle you can afford, take it to the church and light it in his honour, he will forgive you. So he does, and everyone's happy. And I thought, it's just such a wonderful story. It's such fun, and yet it's got all the essential characters of the prophet and the saint and the peasant, and a little bit of kind of peasant cunning mixed in there. So I would say, you know, maybe we can be a little bit more playful too with some of the things that we have, elements we have at our disposal. Calendar customs, mention those too, because they very often combine Christian and old religion elements. This is another lacquer miniature. This is of St. John's Eve, or the Midsummer Festival, as it's known. And this actually would be usually June the 24th, I think. So it's not quite on the solstice, but it's almost there. It'd be a combination of the two things, the idea of the solstice, the idea of St. John. And on that night, these flowers were said to bloom for one night only, the Magic Fern, the flowers of fire. And they were also associated not just with St. John, but with the Perun, the thunder god, the fire god. So it gets quite complex. And it was an excuse for the young men and maidens of the village to come out to the forest, spend the whole night there, getting up to all sorts of things, avowedly looking for this fern with its magic flower. And if you found such a fern, you were told to stay close by to it till daybreak. And demons and devils would try to assail you in the night. But if you were firm in your faith in St. John, in the morning, when dawn came, you would find treasure buried nearby, and you would be rewarded. So a mingling of the traditions there. And by the way, these girls are dancing what's called a horovod, which is the very ancient circle dance, women's dance in Russia. So I could go on about examples, but I think that's given enough examples. And the last section, I want to sort of draw some of the threads together and give you I'll give you a couple more examples, perhaps from different cultures, is the relevance to us today and how we go about recognising this. I think we probably all have access to some kind of folk or cultural dimension of religion that we can draw on. It has a resonance, and things which people have practiced over the years, even at quite a common and garden level, that resonance creates an entry point for us. It gives it a kind of meaning. I've always loved the English folk carols, some of which are in the official carol books, some of which aren't. They were collected by folk song collectors. Beautiful things which are kind of work creatively with legends of Mary and Joseph. For example, how the cherry tree bowed down to Mary when she wanted to eat some fruit, and so on. I'd love to go into all those, but I shan't have time. So we can kind of pick up on that. And sometimes even the idea of making a revival is not such a bad idea. The purists would say, oh, well, once a tradition's died, you can't revive it. But that's not true. For example, the ceremony of well dressings in England, I don't know if any of you know about those, particular to sort of Derbyshire and area of England, northern central, where there are local sacred wells, and there are many sacred wells in the UK, they have pretty much invented a tradition of decorating these with beautifully, it's almost like tapestries of flowers, and creating little gardens by them. And then they have them blessed by the local priest on a Sunday, and there's processions and that. And that's been around for about 150 years, I think. But you would think it goes back till time immemorial, and probably in some sense it does. But it's a tradition that's kind of been built on an old idea. And in Russia, the festival of Maslenitsa is making a comeback. This is their Shrovetide festival, a bit like some of the carnivals you have in other countries. It actually means the fasting time. So it's what you do before you have to start fasting for Lent. You have a great time, and you eat and you drink and you make merry, and you have fairs, and you eat pancakes, which represent the sun coming back in the world. This is a traditional portrayal of it, but this is a modern version in Moscow. Now, it almost died away, but now it's really coming back into the cities. And, you have your rock bands. This is the Maslenitsa doll, who has to be brought out and then ceremonially burnt at the end of the day. There you can see her being brought out, and a little procession of girls. I had a great time on Maslenitsa. There was dancing, and unfortunately there wasn't snow like there was meant to be. It was a bit muddy. There was lots of dancing and music and people having a jolly time. So traditions and festivals which combine elements of folklore and religion are certainly there, and they can be brought back. You might say, well, what culture do you choose? Do you always choose the culture that you live in? I've investigated Russian culture, and it's shed light on a lot of things for me, but I don't think I can really adopt it. I'm not Russian. I don't live there. I mean, if I visit, I can participate. So in one sense, it helps to go to your indigenous culture, but then things aren't always that simple these days. People have mixed heritage. They have roots in one country and live in another. So I think it's something you have to kind of explore for yourself and see what you can take up. And nor has folklore ever been totally divided one nation from another. There have always been, bits passing from one country to another. So there is an element both of tradition and of fluidity. I don't think we should be afraid to use a little creativity there. I would also say that the use of these kind of folk religion traditions can be a means for raising our own consciousness, particularly if we go about it in an attentive way. For example, those three angels at Abraham's table, which, as has been pointed out to us, was set the whole idea of hospitality. What if you thought that every guest at your table was an angel, or every unexpected guest at your door was actually an angel, and you respected them as that? Would that not change our own consciousness and our interaction with that person? I think it would. In England, I don't know if you have the same tradition here, we also have a tradition that if you're in company and a silence suddenly falls, it's a sign that an angel is passing overhead. A very beautiful tradition. And if at that moment you pay attention to something other beyond the here and now, maybe you will hear that angel passing overhead. These traditions can be the doorway to lead us through into another dimension of consciousness, and maybe another dimension of what actually then happens, the kind of magicality of events. Right, I'm not far off. Let me see where I've got to. Oh, yeah. So there's a creativity, and there's the magical element of religion that we can bring in with these folk traditions. And I think we have some good examples in our own common traditions that we can make use of. What have we just had? We've just had Halloween leading to All Saints' Day. There's a picture I took in Boston, I wish I could show you, but I haven't downloaded it, which was actually this sort of whole wall dedicated to all the different saints with all their names and pictures. And then she'd put up turnip lanterns and skeletons and saying, "Happy Halloween from the Saints," or something like that. So it was a wonderful hybrid. And in fact, actually, they do represent two very different sort of states of consciousness, if you like. I mean, certainly in England, we don't have Halloween to the great degree that you have it here, but the energy gets very chaotic, very charged, quite challenging on Halloween. And my own father went into his last hours on Halloween, and I was so grateful I couldn't explain why, in some sense, that he made it through to All Souls Day, that he died on All Souls Day. I felt that was just so much more fitting. And there was a sense of peace around then. But the downside of that was that as I got called, I got woken up by the phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning to come, because he was already died on All Souls Day. I went out and somebody had broken my car window in a Halloween prank. So the Halloween energy had had its effect. But, you know, we can't sort of necessarily suppress that kind of chaotic energy of Halloween, because that's what it's about. And in a way, it kind of makes All Souls Day what it is. There is also the festival of the 12 days of Christmas, which I did some research on for a course I was on, which really grabbed my interest. And why do we have these 12 days of Christmas between Christmas and what we call Epiphany? And there is an astronomical reason for that. I think in brief, it's that the mornings go on getting darker until the 6th of January, even though the evenings are getting lighter. And so in many, certainly European cultures, it took on this kind of duality, light, dark, and was considered to be 12 days out of time, 12 days out of the normal cycle of the year. And very common to practice divination on those days, to do something to forecast the months of the year. For example, in Russia, they would visualize an oak tree with 12 nests in its branches, one for every month of the year. Each nest contains 4 eggs, representing the 4 weeks of the month, and each egg has 7 chicks inside it, waiting to hatch out as the days of the week. Beautiful symbol of the year ahead. And it could be quite an unnerving time. There is an old Irish saying that on the 12th night, the souls of the dead are thicker than the sand on the seashore. There is another saying that on the 12 days of Christmas, the gates of heaven are open. So I would invite you to try and experience in whatever way you can the gates of heaven opening on those 12 days of Christmas, and maybe taking a little peek into the spirit world if you care to. So many traditions associated with that, which I can't go into now, but a very interesting tradition that has again been overlooked. And then, okay, you get to 12th night, you get to Epiphany, you get to January the 6th, and even there you find significant differences between how different countries celebrate that. In other words, the folk element. Russians are only getting round to Christmas by then in the Orthodox Church because they've kept the old calendar. In Western Europe, we call it the arrival of the Magi, and I think here too, the Epiphany, the coming of the light. But let's go back to Ethiopia. I'm going to end with Ethiopia. This is a totally different festival of Timkat, which I was present at. And this is when they take their Ark of the Covenant replicas down to the waters to immerse them in the water as a kind of blessing ritual. And everyone gets dressed up in their, it's the baptism ritual is January the 6th. Everyone gets dressed up in their best, and these young guys have these tall sticks, and they do amazing stick dances. And the priests bring out the holy images. These are the umbrellas of the priest, part of their ceremonial dress. It's kind of huge massed crowd, and everyone rejoicing and taking this sacred ark down to the river to be bathed, and then they all jump in the water too. So really there are different ways we can celebrate these festivals and tie them into the calendar. And there are also prayers that can be crafted in the folk tradition. I'll probably have time to read you one, because I want to read the quote that follows it. Let me just find it. Russian herbalists, by the way, traditionally when the Russian herbalist went out to pick herbs, or herbs you say, don't you, for remedies, they would bow to the earth 6 times before they set out to pick their herbs. That was to Mother Earth, and when they got to the spot where the plant was growing, they would say, again, the 2 faiths, Lord bless me, and you, Mother Fresh Earth, bless me to cull this plant. You have brought it forth for man's use, and thus I take you. From the earth, a plant, from God, a medicine. Beautiful prayer. Yeah, that really struck me then. So skillfully woven together. And another collection, which is what I'm going to end with, was taken down from the Gaelic. Some of you may know this collection called the Sun Dances. It's translations of Gaelic prayers. And they come from a huge collection by somebody called Alexander Carmichael. In the 19th century, he collected original Gaelic prayers and folk songs and so on. And he said, "Who the thinkers and whence the stream, who can tell? These poems were composed by the learned, but they have not come down through the learned, but through the unlearned." So he saw it's a kind of stream which comes down to us. And I think I'll just conclude by reading a prayer for the blessing of your loom, your weaving loom, from the Gaelic. "Thrums nor odds of thread my hand never kept, nor shall keep. Every colour is the bow of the shower. Every colour has gone through my fingers beneath the cross. White and black, red and madder, green, dark grey and scarlet, blue and roan, and colour of the sheep, and never a particle of cloth was wanting. I beseech calm bride, that's St. Bridget, the generous. I beseech mild Mary, the loving. I beseech Christ Jesu, the humane, that I may not die without them, that I may not die without them." And I think that's a fitting place to end this talk. So thank you very much.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned November 4th, because it's coming right up and it's election day in America.
Yes, so it is.
And I feel a tremendous spiritual dimension going on in our country and in the whole planet because of what's happening with a huge political shift. And
Yes.
I'm playing, and you're supposed to play on November 4th, you said.
Yes.
So I'm just playing with the idea of how it's all connected.
Ah, well, I read November the 4th. It didn't dawn on me, but actually, would you like me to read you what it says for November the 4th? It might give you some ideas. Okay, 4th of November was an important day in the folk calendar. It was a major holiday devoted to the miracle-working Kazan icon of the Mother of God. It was a day of fun, with the work in the field being over, and the house full of good food following the harvest, and with some money earned by selling the surplus in the market. The holiday was called, therefore, Kazan Merrymaking. It was one of the main women's holidays. The Mother of God was regarded as the defender of women. Young girls would look forward to this day with great hope. If a girl thought she was not quite good-looking and therefore unloved, she would get up that morning and run to the nearest woods. There she would find a birch tree leaf covered with hoarfrost. The belief was that if she looked into this leaf, as if in a mirror, her looks would improve. It would be a different girl entirely who made her way back to the village, because belief is the best remedy. Inspired, she would win a boy's heart with her trepidation and expectation of love. Well, if we're trying to make a magical connection with that, it does emphasise hope and the harvest being in, and you can't do any more now, so you might as well enjoy the fruits of what's to come. I'm improvising here, but I think there is scope. Hope and love seem to be the things, and maybe carrying that, in our hearts for the day, and seeing its harvest. And, as we sow, so shall we reap, and we hope the fruits will be good ones. So how about that?
I thought it was interesting that you said it was the day that you invoked the mother aspect. Because with the divine feminine coming in and the mother being important on that day, and maybe a new birth in our country and for things that are coming.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
Just one thing to add to that. My impression is that the reason that elections are on November 4th is for some very similar reason, that because America was an agricultural country until 2 or 3 generations ago, elections were set then because the harvest would be over and people would actually have time to go and vote. So there might actually be a practical aspect to that as well.
That could be true. Just a little aside on that. Do you have Harvest Festival in the US? You have Thanksgiving. It's kind of a bit different. Interestingly enough, because I was going to say that, when you try out different customs and that, going back to this idea of the spirit of the land and the culture, if they take, they take, and if they don't take, they don't take. And Harvest Festival is really big in the UK, particularly in September, October. But I discovered when I went to the Harvest Festival service the other week that it was only, as it were, invented in the 19th century by an eccentric Cornish clergyman who again brought in an old traditional harvest home folk practice into the church where it was accepted and has now become a part. But it's obviously that there was a kind of a welcome for it. So that's how, just a little aside on the harvest element.
We do have it a little bit with John Barleycorn and all the stories with around that. But I notice also in music and opera that there's a lot of this folk tunes that will weave into an opera.
You mean Russian opera?
Yeah.
Yes.
Which makes it beautiful how complex it is.
Yes.
It's the same as what you're saying.
Yes, there is a lot of Russian folk tradition into the art and the music and the literature. They have never discarded it. And in Russia, fairy tales are taken seriously as stories for grown-ups, not just for children. And as one village artist said to me, fairy stories are the wise thoughts of poor people, which is kind of a nice definition.
I find your folk tale very interesting because I think all of us have to decide who is going to be St. Nicholas on November 4th.
It seems to me that what you said indicates something very strange about American culture, which is in some ways impoverished. When I go back to Wales, where my family comes from, I find holy wells and sacred traditions, but they've all been lost here.
Is that so? Would anybody dispute that, or would you agree that many have been lost? I think we've got a few...
Well, you see, we don't have any holy places in quite the same way that you do in Europe.
We have the Native American names, but we don't connect them.
Yeah.
Right.
You think it needs more time? But there's one or two other people. Do you mind if I take a couple of comments on that? Because it's very interesting. It did go through my mind when I was preparing it. I thought, but I thought you'll be the experts to tell me how it relates to your country.
I was thinking on that venue too, in that it might be a way to bring some rituals. We're always craving for rituals, and we've lost some of the, even Paul Bunyan and the Johnny Appleseed. Those are kind of our folk traditions that are kind of let go, and bringing those are obviously like. Johnny Appleseed is either spring or fall, I'm not sure, but bringing some of those rituals, and I can see that ritual is so much a part of what they're doing with the folk tales and enriching our own lives by making some connection.
Yeah, well, I did suggest that revivals are always possible. You don't go into an English field and find a shepherd sitting down singing a folk song. It doesn't kind of happen like that anymore. But folk songs are still sung here, and even if it's more consciously. And on the question of folk songs, some of the greatest versions of the child ballads and English folk songs were collected in America, particularly in the Appalachian Mountains and in Newfoundland. Fantastic collections, or in a purer form than kind of we had back on the mainland. So maybe there are elements which could be looked at and brought back to the surface again.
I brought up the Native American connection, and I think we have a very rich heritage, particularly where I'm from, in central New York, the five tribes, there's some amazing stuff. Joanne Shenandoah, a folk singer from the Oneida tribe, has done some amazing things that I think connects very much with a Christian spirituality. There's just amazing parallels going on. But here in the United States, we have yet to really connect the two. There's some connecting going on, but I think we need to do a lot more.
Which gives some scope for creativity as well.
Two things. One is that part of the issue is that in immigration, because of assimilation, we lost so much of that. And so there are pockets, like from my Franco-American tradition, there are certainly things that are done that are still carried forward in certain areas of the state of Maine.
Yeah.
And the other piece is the pagan community, which still continues to work from a ritualistic point. Like Halloween is not reduced to Halloween. It is Samhain. Yes. It's the day of the thinning of the veil and high respect for the ancestors and those who have passed on and making connections again. Yes. So a most holy day in the same way that All Souls Day is. And so I think we just need to remind ourselves that they are there and to pay attention to what's going on in our communities.
Yes, I wanted to just follow up when you were mentioning about the Southern Appalachians. We live there, and I've been there since 1979, and some of the native peoples, of course, all came from Scotland and Ireland.
Yes.
And our neighbor, who's 11th generation, was telling me that he always plants his corn when the leaves of the white oak are the size of a squirrel's ear.
Lovely.
Okay?
Great,
and he never, and has a wonderful crop, of course, every year.
Yes.
Along with that, there are many sacred places, of course, mostly from Native American, but the immigrants coming over from the UK picked up on those things. So there's lots of, there's sacred streams and wells and mountains around us, and we really can feel that. There's a marvelous movie many of you may have seen called Songcatcher. I highly recommend it. It's one of the most beautiful movies ever done. It's about a set in the early 20th century, a woman musicologist who wants to study the source of the mountain music goes down into the Appalachians. And the singers and performers are all native people.
Oh, it sounds my kind of movie. I'll have to try and get hold of it.
Highly recommended. Songcatcher.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, one person I think I should mention in this context is Colston Brown, who was originally going to be here and present, but wasn't able to because of passport issues or something. His book on magical Christianity back there is very good. And the reason I bring him up in this context is that he had a very interesting observation about all of this, which is something he described as the rift. And it is a sense of kind of deep inner disconnection, you know, that many people feel from like the traditions of the land in this country. And, you know, it's almost like a break in kind of the psychic firmament. And he wrote a piece called Healing the Rift, which deals with this, and this will be in the Quest magazine next March. So it is very, it's a serious issue that's there, and it's not often very well addressed, although it's very frequently felt.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say that it partly depends on your perspective, how you see American sacred places. But, for example, the Vietnam War Memorial, I think, is a sacred place. Also, the Grand Canyon and Yosemite and other great natural places of natural beauty. And I think from a certain perspective, Disneyland or Disney World is also a place of pilgrimage for Americans. I mean, and it celebrates, you know, the Seven Dwarfs and
that's something to chew over. Thank you.
And Williamsburg, Independence Hall, and Plymouth Rock. I mean, so there.
Well, I have to admit, I stayed 2 days in Boston on the way out, and I was looking through my guidebook, and I was reading about the State Hall, and it said, "Here is the sacred cod." And I thought, I have to go and see this sacred cod. I don't know if any of you have been, but there's this fish hanging up, which the sacred cod in the hall, and the representatives won't do business unless the cod is in place. So.
Hi, I'd just like to thank you for including aspects that relate to other cultures besides the Russian culture. Part of that rift is that each of us kind of carries our own perspective, like was said here, and many times that perspective does not include other perspectives. So, and I see that as a way of reaching out to others, even though the focus may be on one particular perspective. One way of helping to mend that rift could be to demonstrate attempts to reach out to others. So I appreciate you including the information about Ethiopia.
Or perhaps to try and see the commonality and then take it to the culture of your choice, because we can't all practice all cultures all the time, but we can try and understand other cultures.
One last question.
Yes, I just wanted to add to the Native American spirit that's been roaming through the room. The Shakers intentionally chose sacred Native American sites for their communities, so that they just added to the energy. And I belong to one in the Berkshires, the Abode of the Message, that's now a Sufi community that is very intentionally adding to those energies. But I think if you're looking for sacred sites, you couldn't do better than visit Shaker communities.
Thank you.